do the study and see
Congrats, by
what.
the way.
Thank you. See what the rates of autism are, and it's really not. In fact, 10,000 patients is probably overdoing it. You probably can see the signal, if there is a signal, with far less, and that's simply it. Now, plenty of health groups are going to now try to mine data and things like that to see. But the best experiment is a real experiment that is not biased or post hoc, but it's like set up right away to be fair and all coming, and all these statistical principles that are well done to ensure the fairness of the trial. And I think again, it's kind of like sad to sort of point to a boogeyman and not have like an actual reason to do so. And I feel like their little their thing is really dangerous because people believe governments with sometimes blind allegiance, as many people on the right and the left do. There is this like, that's my baseball team, right? That's my football team. And when it's your football team, you're really like rooting for them. And you'll start to believe regardless. Like the whole ivermectin thing was another sad state of affairs. And if you are blindly going to believe in something, well, that's going to actually have real human impact, right? And I feel like it's sad to like push bad science on people when like our modern world is governed by science. Our modern world is like highly scientific. It requires more and more science literacy, and like to be a bad example for science literacy, I think is not good. Now, on the flip side, Trump has a lot of smart science people around him, so it's not like completely, fallen on deaf ears. He's got tons and tons of really bright people giving advice, lobbing advice in, and I think there's a check and balances there where RFK has probably gotten tons of pushback over the last whatever, how long he's been in his position. And so I feel like, I don't worry about it too much, because if they do really crazy things, people will resign, you'll see it. And, just doing one news conference that Tylenol causes autism, the only thing that's going to happen is people are going to laugh, and, that's basically what happened. Everyone shrugged it off and made memes about it. That's really all that ever happened is, some joking memes about people taking Tylenol. Now, I don't think we know how Tylenol even works, because it's this very old drug, and many old drugs kind of work that way, where we actually have no clue what the mechanism of action is for metformin, for example, and like we just don't know how or why these drugs work, and that's kind of remarkable, but at the same time, like, that is dangerous. I mean, when you don't know how a medicine works, it actually could be secretly causing harm all along. Now, I'll say that Tylenol's been around forever, and the likelihood that it all of a sudden created this massive increase in autism is so unlikely that it wouldn't be even on my top 10 hypothesis. But it's again, every hypothesis is a good hypothesis when you have infinite money. When you have infinite money, you might as well check out every hypothesis you have. And if we can come to a conclusion for autism, it would be wonderful. People with autism suffer a terrible fate, and families as well. And it would be fantastic if we could reduce the amount of autism. So I applaud an attempt, but I think that this is the wrong direction, because it has to be rooted in experimentation.
Yeah. My question would be, because from what I understand, they were saying that like obviously there has been a significant increase from the 1980s or something. Like it was 1 in 1,000 with autism. Now it's 1 in 34. I don't know where they got that statistics from, whether it's true or not. But what I'm trying to understand basically is that like from your pharmaceutical experience and by the biotech industry, even in the past few decades that of experience you have, do you have any like have you ever had any instances of like you guys talking about like what could be the causes of increase in autism? Is it like phenotypic stuff, or is it just because of like increase in the quality of life standards and in the medical practice? Like, do you have any
Yeah.
hypothesis basically like why you think
Oh yeah, for
autism is
sure.
spiking up recently?
Oh, definitely. I Novartis approached us to do an autism drug, and we agreed to take the project on. And they and we spent some time on this, and I think there's many legitimate hypotheses. Probably the best one is autoimmunity, because autoimmune diseases have grown at the same time, sort of same time frame overlap exactly. not the same magnitude exactly, but similar magnitude. And, in medicine, almost like half of all disease has like this immune component. So autoimmunity is like a very good explanation for so many things.
Interesting, interesting.
And I think that's a reasonable start. Some researchers at Stanford showed that there is some mother-child autoimmunity. For example, I mean, one of the things that happens when you have a baby is that you have this sort of self non-self issue as a mother, right? You have this thing growing inside of you, and your immune system naturally kind of wants to get rid of it, and you have to have this sort of immune training and immune suppression to sort of get it to a place where you're not rejecting this graft. There's a graft versus host disease, for example, when you have a transplant, and nevertheless, the baby persists, but it's not totally unlikely that some of the fetal proteins, which the mother's body has either never seen or potentially has only seen since development, that those fetal proteins can cause an immune response. And if there's an immune response that affects the fetus, that could be a very dangerous thing. So I feel like there's a lot of science to do there, and immunity for almost every unexplained medical phenomenon, immunity is a decent guess and start. Now, what will we do about it? I don't know. One of the reasons, as many people have talked about, what immunity is, autoimmunity has grown mostly in the US, but not in other parts of the world, is the so-called hygiene hypothesis, where we have a very, very clean world in the US relative to other parts of the world. And that cleanliness results in the immune system training on very innocuous things, especially the self, because it's not being infected round the clock by foreign organisms. For example, in Africa, almost every rare tropical disease is present in Africa. I mean, you go anywhere, you can be infected by worms, by malaria, by all kinds of parasites, and you need to evolve an immune system to handle that. In America, none of those things really exist, so we don't have schistosomiasis or malaria or TB that's endemic. So ultimately, the only thing our immune system has to fight is itself. And autoimmunity is what that is: psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, etc. There's like 50 autoimmune diseases. Um, and so the hygiene hypothesis is a pretty good one. After that, you're really starting to talk about other interesting things like epigenetics, age age of parent, age of husband, age of wife. You have just random developmental kind of mutations that occur. Um, some people think there's a strong epigenetic component that's inherited. I think there's, some important. Hello, anybody there?
Yeah, I'm there. Yeah, yeah. Sorry.
No, it's
Are
okay.
you still
Uh,
there?
Yeah, sorry.
yeah,
It was just my internet was kind of iffy at the end. Sorry.
yeah. Some people blame SSRIs, which is an interesting hypothesis. And again, any hypothesis should be respected, and not equally maybe, but respected and tried out. And if you take mothers who take SSRIs, put them in one group, take mothers who don't, put them in another group, you might be able to learn something. Now, the problem, of course, is that SSRIs themselves are a biasing factor. So you sort of have to carefully kind of figure out, how to do that study. But most studies that have looked at that have not seen the link yet. But it is possible that it could be something like that. Um, but everyone searched really hard for an answer to this, and it's not that obvious what it is. There's no consensus at
Yeah,
all.
yeah. Basically, my most basic understanding for this issue was that like I believe that like when obviously as time goes on, like our healthcare system is becoming much more better, and we're developing much more medications, right? And obviously a lot of these medications they go through all kinds of tests, and we don't know what it could be like side effects. But I just my main theory was basically that like, as our medical field gets better and we have a greater understanding of how to treat women, especially like in the maternal care and stuff like that, you're gonna see much more increases in some, because obviously autism is not some sort of like it's not some sort of, sometimes it's inherited, but sometimes as well it could be phenotypic, could be inherited as well. Like there are so many contributing factors, but I do genuinely believe that like that it is just because obviously our healthcare system is getting well, and we're using so many medications that we don't know the total,
It could
obviously
be
the
it could be a combination of that plus hygiene. It could be many things. I mean, I think
yeah,
that,
that's what I'm saying. There's so many things going on. So,
yeah, it's
you
really
know,
hard to figure it out. And I think
and
that,
also like I don't think that the autism that they're even talking about is even like because a lot of people in America, from what I've seen, it's like they have autism, but it's not really like the one where like it's like it's mostly like high functional autism, right? Like they can speak, they can go to work, they are very active in the communities, but it's just that like maybe they have some certain character traits of like maybe they can't socialize properly. We see that a lot in Japan, especially with the increase in of is it hikikomoris and whatever people who spend a lot of their time at home. Like we see an increase in that in Japan as well, where like first world country, very good healthcare system, but there's still a lot of people out there with like social either as well. So
yeah, no, there's definitely a social perspective there because, what I mean, high functioning autism is often indistinguishable from being weird. And I think that, a lot of people conflate those two. Obviously, the medical definition is much more clear and not ambiguous at all. But I think that just socially, we're very, like, because it's like a behavioral and psychiatric disorder. It's very easy to sort of talk about it in vague terms, like the same way we do about depression and schizophrenia and bipolar and even OCD. How many times have you told somebody, don't be so OCD? But they're probably not actually obsessive compulsive. Which is a very specific kind of severe thing. You can we sort of are more familiar with that because you might not you would never say to somebody, oh, stop being so beta thalassemic. It'd be a very funny thing to accuse somebody of, but we can daily accuse somebody of having something so autistic, and it sort of just permeates in our sort of daily parlance. So I feel like that doesn't help at all. And nevertheless, I mean, I think that genetics are giving lots of clues. Fragile X disease, Rett syndrome, even Down syndrome are all amongst you know really hundreds of syndromic intellectual disabilities are providing genetic clues because there we see the monogenic phenotype. And in Fragile X, the binding partners of the Fragile X protein are so large that it's actually not that useful to figure out what's going on. But you can see that this sort of master switch protein is doing a lot of different things, and that it's implicated. Okay, well now you take the Rett protein, which is sort of similar, where it kind of interacts with hundreds of proteins. Now what does that do? And slowly but surely we sort of get to a picture of like what is actually happening in the autistic brain. I think the hardest part about this disease, unlike say cancer or something like that, is that we're dealing with a meta organ. The brain is an organ. We can deal with the brain with brain diseases like epilepsy or MS, but the mind is not an organ. The mind is something that emerges from the brain, and that the mind is much harder to diagnose. It's sort of like a software program instead of the hardware program, and or the hardware. The hardware is sort of easy to detect if something's wrong. Okay, the voltage isn't right, or it's missing a piece here, or something like that. Kind of easy. So then there's subtle ones for hardware too. But the software that arises from our hardware, our mental hardware, our neurons that give rise to this consciousness, we really have no idea how that happens. And we have no idea. We're starting to learn from computer science of all places how it happens. But we really don't know what that operating system or programming language looks like. We simply just know it seems to be something like a neural network that we use in AI. It seems to be somewhat related to that, and that other than that, we have no idea how to, for example, make the weights uh, pruned, or to have some faster gradient descent, or some like the mechanisms we have in computer science to adjust neural networks. We don't really know what's happening in our brain's neural network, which is kind of funny, given that one inspired the other. But I do think that we're going to learn, and I think we'll somewhat be able to come up with some of these answers a little more easily with the help of, believe it or not, computer science. But medicine itself moves very, 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 very slowly. And I think the technologists, every billionaire technologist I know, wants medicine to move really, really fast, like technology, and it's just not the way it works. Unfortunately, it's such a slow, moving system that, we just have to take our time and run the experiments the best we can. And it's similar to me in math, where like Fermat's last theorem, I mentioned this sometimes, needed 300 or 400 years of mathematical scaffolding to be built before the problem could be legitimately attacked by Wiles. And I think that, in some ways psychiatry is the same, where we know there's a problem. In the case of Fermat's last theorem, we knew what the problem was and how to state it, but we didn't know how to solve it. And here with psychiatry, that's sort of the same case. Somebody who's very depressed is easy to tell something's wrong with them. Somebody who's schizophrenic, it's very easy. Someone who's autistic, it's quite easy to see. So the diagnosis is simple, but the treatment is really impossible because we don't understand what's actually happening. And as we build that scaffolding up, slowly but surely, someone's going to say, "Oh, maybe this is why people are depressed," and they'll approach it and say, "Okay, now that we have these really good single cell epigenetic tools in a live, in a live human, imagining this tool, I don't know if it'd be useful or not, but it seems very hard to make." And we have this great tool, like let's apply it to depression. Oh my gosh, what do you know? It turns out that it is epigenetics all along, and there's something called serotonylation, which is like a new phenomenon that is a post-translational modification where serotonin itself is actually attached to proteins, which is a very bizarre kind of thing, but that's what happens. And the serotonylation could be the secret SYSRIs are sort of implicated in not just depression, but also other things like autism. And serotonylation is the answer, and we got to do some special anti-serotonin drug, and we'll fix autism. I don't know. Something like that could be you know, the answer, but it could be 100 years away. And that's the frustrating thing is that, for Maslow's theorem, nobody's life was on the line. Nobody was suffering because we couldn't answer that question other than a few crazy mathematicians. Really, nobody was suffering. But people do suffer in the millions from these psychiatric diseases, and it's sad. But we also have to wait. I mean, what did people do when there was no penicillin and somebody died of an infection, a human being, a baby, a mother? You know, we had to deal with it, and there was no good way to deal with it. And we blamed gods and things like that. And then we learned that maybe, you can fix this. And we fixed it. And for now, we live in this twilight of prehistory where, you know, we can't do anything for you really if you have autism and many other psychiatric diseases. We can do something for schizophrenia and something for these other diseases, but not much. And the question becomes like, when will we live in a modern world where treating depression is just as simple as giving somebody, an antibiotic for a serious infection that would normally kill you? So hopefully that we live in that world soon, but I don't think we're going to see it in my lifetime, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the top like I really love your comparison of like the brain to like a neural network, which is there's a lot of developments nowadays, and especially with AI. And I was just thinking, it's just that you went to a different tangent, but I was thinking that maybe like with respect to I don't know how it's gonna work, but if you can integrate a lot of AI and LLMs into basically studying much more about the human mind and the similarity. Because I saw a recent research that they were able to replicate images of like mental images, like using AI for some people and stuff like that. And I feel like AI is a very good tool nowadays to explore the mind more in detail. And I don't know, like, what are your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think you guys know my wife works at OpenAI, and we talk about
Oh,
this kind of
congrats.
stuff all the time. And I know a lot of the folks in the AI community at XAI and other AI places. And I think that most of those people aren't that interested in this question, which is funny, um, because I think that they have jobs and work to do that's like very narrow. And I think if you zoom out a little bit, this is probably a more important question because, and I would love almost to be, if I had the time, if I wasn't a capitalist, if I had the time to look into this question, I would. But the question I would have is, how can we create a computer system that mimics the infant really well? Because I just had this baby, and everybody's asked this question. But like when you have a baby, you ask yourself like, well, how is it learning? And I joke with my my partner that my hypothesis, which is that when we sleep, we're sort of doing the equivalent of training a neural network, and that he gets this experience from his 6 hours of wake time, and then he goes and trains really important part of the training, that first layer of neurons that's going to guide him for the rest of his life gets trained now. And that's why so many people who are orphans end up having serious problems later on in life, and people who have developmental delay had problems early in life and things like that. And I think that makes sense to most people. But, you know, if you put it in the neural network perspective, it seems more obviously true. And then it also answers questions like, well, why do babies have to sleep 18 hours a day? What's so special about sleep? And that could be the answer. So in any event, he's training his little neural network, getting up, experiencing things. Then he learns. And after a month, he learns how to smile because he has reinforcement learning. And his reinforcement learning, his dad and mom are very happy when he smiles. So he does it more and he does it more, and he realizes that he can get things by smiling. And he's getting his dopamine reward and other rewards. And all of a sudden, he's being RL'd into smiling a lot. And it's great. And he's already sort of done the crying RL. So he's in this reinforcement learning world that is giving him all kinds of rewards and punishments based on what he's doing. And, slowly and slowly he's learning. So to me, it'd be really fascinating if we could we have sensory data, like we have lots of data now. It'd be really interesting to sort of train an infant from scratch. Now, what's nice about doing that is we can accelerate it, right? Like you don't have to do it the same speed that an infant learns. You could do it faster, but it would be nice to see the milestones kind of like match up exactly, where there's a limited ability to interact with the stimulus and try to make it as close to humans as possible. Now, again, I think a lot of people find this exercise would be too contrived and not that scientific, and maybe it's not that interesting. Why not just skip to the interesting problem? But I'd almost rather do it the naturalistic way, because I think that we'd maybe learn more. But again, people who have studied this their whole lives, they don't want to think outside of the box that's been created by Bengio and Hinton and the other researchers who have done marvelous, LeCun and others. And if you're going to make new paradigms or ground, it has to be amazing right away. And that's one of the problems with academic and corporate research is it's kind of like, well, if you have nothing to show for your research after a while, you kind of are cooked, and you have to be competitive. And we're in a world where lots of money is being thrown around on this space. So doing something really unique and really different is kind of difficult. Now, people try anyway. And the rumor is that, Ilya Sutskever, the OpenAI co-founder and SSI founder, his new company, Super Safe Intelligence or whatever, has a new approach, and that it is bearing fruit. It could be a breakthrough in AI. Nevertheless, the point is that, there are people experimenting, thankfully, but how much they're being told or asked to experiment on things that are like really different, I think is, it's probably unfortunately leans more to like the familiar than the different. And that's sort of a shame because, it makes sense. Like I think Mira Murati's company, for example, Thinking Machines, like if I were her, I'd do the same thing as a CEO. I'd want to like, okay, how do we train faster? Let's look at some of the issues with training a neural network that or make it really slow, and see if we can, why do we need $100 billion to train a neural network? Let's think about the obvious answer, which is how do we spend $1 billion? And I think companies like OpenAI and others, Elon too, have said, well, fuck it, we have something that's working, then let's just spend the 100 billion. What difference does it make? And better to have the bird in the hand than try to accelerate it and get the bird in the bush, or two in the bush. And because if somebody accelerates, we'll just figure it out then. And I think that it's an interesting contrast. And then, like I said, there's the total fringe, which is maybe we should not even be working on LLMs, which recently Richard Sutton came out and said. I think a lot of people, one really funny example was they said that it was like Kanye coming out as a Nazi was the same thing as Richard Sutton coming out as anti-LLM. And Sutton, when your hero disappoints you. But Sutton's working, I think, still think he's working with John Carmack. So I think, it is good for him to try something different. I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think, just because a guy says he thinks X does not mean that he's right. And I don't know if he's right or not, but I do think if you're John Carmack or you're SSI or you're another thing, you probably are wasting your time going down the LLM road anyway, because you're sort of being outmatched by the LLM innovators and the people that are, really understand that and invented it and so forth. So I would try something different if I were them too. But, you know, if you haven't borne any fruit in anything, I think, and you're saying LLMs don't work, well, to me, that's just sour grapes. Show what does work. If you're so sure that LLMs won't scale, then show us what does, because right now it's the best we've got. So anyway, I think it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out, and I think it's only going to be for humanity's benefit. Like if Carmack can come up with something great, which most people feel is pretty unlikely, then I think that that'd be really exciting. If it's SSI, even so much the better, or any other company for that matter, because I think the only thing that we're going to get in the next 10 to 50 years is like more and more advanced computer reasoning, which is kind of cool. I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, especially like I was just thinking the other day that like the more AI is becoming more advanced nowadays, like it's really gonna be really hard to differentiate between like um reality and like AI and like I don't, because I'm studying computer science in university and I really don't know where to go right now, and I'm just looking at other alternatives and stuff like that, but hopefully
Yeah,
it
I think
doesn't
I think computer.
hopefully it doesn't make things worse for us, but
I
I
don't
think
think
there are
so.
very good
Yeah,
ways
I,
there are very good ways of integrating, with respect to work and stuff, but it's
I think it's going to make things.
we're getting there way too quickly, it's kind of scary, honestly.
I wouldn't be scared. I'd be excited. I mean, the world's gonna tilt more and more and more towards computer engineering, and that's, I
Yeah.
think, a good thing if you're studying it. And demand for, we can't find great programmers in New York City. I mean, it's almost impossible. And so like, we're
Sorry.
we're talking about going from paying people 200 or 300 a year to 300 or 400 to try to attract people, but it's not even working. And it's it's just one of these things where like, you know, people are scared of the automation, but what's being automated is some of the obvious and easy work that should have been automated already. And the stuff that's not being automated is the next layer of exciting things that we all now get to work on. So the field is kind of being like, it's kind of like tractors. Tractors didn't eliminate the farmer, they supercharged the farmer. They let the farmer farm like crazy. And now that was able to feed the whole world. They'll never, literally never be famine, because farming is such a, you can really scale a huge farm with modern agricultural tools. And so the idea that we you know we're going to need less is hard to believe. Now we got sated with enough farmers, so the amount of farmers has dropped dramatically around the world, because one farmer can handle all the work that 10 or 20 or 100 farmers can. But in computer science, what's interesting about that is it's really like an elemental thing that is only bounded by creativity. Food is bounded by your appetite. At some point, you don't need more food, but computers are tools that unleash creativity and productivity. So there's really no limit to the amount of things that we need from them and want from them. So I do think like prompt engineering is somewhat becoming like a new type of programming language, but really we've already had a word for this, which is called systems programming. And building a system is very, very different from building a little toolkit, or like a single page application. Like I recently built a single page application with Cursor in, really just a few hours, that is a database wrapper that helps me enter and adjust research reports much more quickly. And it's something that normally would have taken, maybe a week, or more, but now it takes, a couple of hours, and it's wonderful. But I still could not architect a really big, bulky, wide, far-flung system very easily, because it systems engineering is still laborious, and it still will require a human in a lot of ways, picking out vendors, thinking about trade-offs, all of these things. And still AI will help us a little bit. And I think in years to come, we'll elevate yet again into new places where we start thinking about, okay, maybe I should make a new chip for this, and that's something nobody's ever done. You never sit and write a computer program and say, I want my own hardware, because I think if I made my own hardware, this would go faster. We might move into a world that looks like that, possibly, or an FPGA where not only am I going to write the program, but I'm going to write the hardware too. That could be the kind of world we migrate to, and those possibilities are endless. I mean, they're so exciting to think about. Imagine writing your own OS for your own program for your own hardware. And the stack is perfectly suited to the exact problem you have. And people do this, of course, for really big problems, but only for very, very, very large, multi-billion-dollar problems.
Arguably, NixOS lets me do this every day.
I want to hear more about that, but I definitely want to hear more about that. But yes, the idea of I mean, again, your imagination is the only limit, and so far, human imagination is undefeated. And I feel like the amount of things we can do is just going to expand dramatically, and we're already starting to see it a little bit. And I saw this app yesterday about a dentist's office that they didn't have a person answering the phone from 5 o'clock from when they closed to afterwards, and they just had an AI do it, and they were picking up 20 or 30% more business than they did otherwise. Now, of course, they could have had a human do it too, but it's still a remarkable productivity tool, because now whoever that human would have been to pick up the phone, they're now can do something more productive. Some people in society would say, well, maybe that we do need people to do these jobs, because there are people who are just not capable, and letting them sit and answer a phone all day is not such a bad thing for society, because it allows some people to have middle income and things like that. I think there'll always be places for that, and we're obviously starting to see people become content creators more and more, and that's sort of becoming one of the ways that we have that middle class, is by creating content all day, including things like OnlyFans, for better or worse. We sort of have this like self-employed class that's, I predict, will be probably half of our economy. I think people will just stop working and consume, and it might be investments that carries us through. It might be UBI. It might be content creation and other like different things that allow us to self-sustain, including the dropping cost of things due to technology, not just AI, but all kinds of technology. So I feel like, up to half the nation will be unemployed and just sort of on TikTok all day and things like that. And, that's just the world we're going to live in. And the amount of people who actually work really hard is going to be quite small. And there'll still be haves and have-nots, but I think the dystopian vision is that like Brave New World, we have like everything cared for, and we just want the drug, the soma, that is just sort of this anodyne thing that we are addicted to, and just give me the soma. And in a lot of ways, that's what we are. I found myself, for a while, I was very effective and productive, and I think I still am, but like I found myself recently really algorithmically driven by X, and to the point where I would realize that I was sitting on my phone just looking at X for 10, 20, 30 minutes at a time, asking myself, what am I doing? Like I have to do this thing on bonds, I have to do this thing on economic data, I'm behind on this thing that I have to do. And instead of doing all that stuff, I'm sitting there scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and the algorithm got into my brain, and I feel like I have to shake it out of there. But it's this weird thing. And then of course I also see, oh, X has deposited $1,000 in your bank account. Now $1,000 isn't so much for me, but like for a lot of people, it's like, okay, I consumed some content, I created some content, I got paid $1,000 by X. And by the way, I didn't say anything too interesting on X to get that $1,000, so you probably could get it too. But I think like ultimately, like you see that this is going to be the future of everything, including, oh, I have my YouTube, I have my this, I have my that, and I just make cooking things on YouTube, and it's a job to make those videos, but it's an intention job. And you're going to see a lot of people like what videos did you make today? And people criticizing each other over, oh, I can't pay the bills. Well, make some videos. In the old days, they would say, go to work, get a job. Well, now it's going to be, get the camera, get on there. And it's sort of a weird and sad state of affairs. But I do think, like, we're there. I mean, there's nothing we can really do about it.
Yeah.